Step 3, you grow hard about what you want to be. Step 4, everybody just do your thing.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Secular Soapbox on Skeptic Haven. Secular Soapbox is a show where we like to share our opinions on various subjects, always from a secular perspective. I'm your host for tonight, Bryceronee. It's good to see you guys. It's good to be here. I've been away for a little while, but I'm glad to be back, and I look forward to tonight's show. I hope you guys do too. Tonight, we are discussing the afterlife. And we have a couple of special guests, actually 3 of them, starting with Ben Speed Watkins of Real Atheology. What's up?
Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, always a pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to have CeasetoKnow from Axioms on Trial back with us.
Thank you so much. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you. I love having philosophers and people who are basically smarter than me to talk about philosophical topics that will be unsolved for the rest of our lifetimes, probably. But to round out the panel, special guest, Dr. C.M. Lorkowski, pardon me, aka Micky, I guess. Micky is a professor at Kent University and author of Atheism Considered, a survey of the rational rejection of religious belief. What's going on, Micky?
Well, currently fingers crossed because I'm in a thunderstorm warning. So if I disappear suddenly, it's not because you offended me.
Fair enough. I appreciate the warning. I think this is my first time interacting with you. So first of all, it's a pleasure to meet you. And I guess I should just go around the room before we really get into it. We're talking about the afterlife here. What did you guys grow up thinking or understanding about the afterlife, and what is your understanding of it conceptually now? I'll start with Micky and then go down back up the other way. So what are we talking about here, Micky? What is the afterlife?
Well, so one thing we have to be really careful of is depictions of afterlives are almost as varied as believers. I think it's helpful to sort into 3 main and popular kinds. So one is not so common in the US would be reincarnation. The reincarnation cycle where you have continuous rebirths. A more common one in the US is a resurrection of the body, which is what it sounds like, that somehow we come up in our perfected version of our own bodies and are elsewhere doing bodily things. The more common one, especially since the modern period in philosophy started, is to have an afterlife as a place of minds, where soul is equated with mind, bodiless, locationless beings of pure thought. Now, when I was growing up, I was raised Roman Catholic, who do kind of a pick and choosy, not quite clear aspects of the latter 2.
Gotcha. How about you, Cease? What was your understanding of whatever kind of afterlife that you were told existed when you were growing up, and what do you think that the larger argument is about?
Well, I mean, I've been lucky in the sense that I didn't grow up with a religious background. So I kind of came into these questions as a teenager, just being interested in seeing what was it that people across cultures believed, and just studied a variety of perspectives, right? I've always, just intuitively, I've always been a physicalist and a naturalist. So to me, the concept of a disembodied mind
doesn't really make sense, I guess.
I've never been able to grasp it as something that makes any sense to me. And when I think of the fact that if we damage the brain, something about conscious experience is lost. But if we were to damage the brain, entirely at death, this idea that then we rise up from our bodies and retain some kind of selfhood and can float around in heaven recognizing family members is something that just completely doesn't make any sense to me. So that's been kind of my approach. Is just, I understand the reasoning why people are afraid of death, because I used to be afraid of death. I'm not anymore. I understand what drives people to want to hold these ideas close, but I see no reason to accept it as truth.
Okay. And I'll pretty much ask the same question to Speed, although I will temper it with, I wrote a bunch of things down here when I was pondering how I was going to ask the question, just to kind of give myself ideas. And I wrote down heaven, hell, Valhalla, purgatory, reincarnation, and ghostly limbo. So which one of these things is true, if any, and how could we know, and do any of them make sense?
Yeah, so my upbringing was in more of an evangelical Protestant tradition. And so the idea in the faith that I grew up in is that the afterlife was a real place that we could know about, and that it was very, whether the afterlife was good or bad was intimately connected with the actions that we had in this life. And so it could be a reward or it could be a punishment. And that it was almost kind of silly to think that there wasn't this sort of sharp axiological divide to an afterlife, this idea of dying and just being dead, and it just being nothing. That just kind of just wasn't even on the table.
That's interesting to me, because that seems like the common sense thing to believe unless you're told otherwise. So how do you think that was just the result of the indoctrination, that you were told to believe in the afterlife first, or did that seem intuitively?
Well, so I also think that there's a much larger Christian narrative that these views about an afterlife are woven into. So it's not like people consciously form a sophisticated concept of an afterlife and how they're going to know about it, and then take it on as part of their worldview. It's kind of when you become a Christian, it kind of gets taken on as a package deal. And certainly being within a Protestant tradition, so there were certain things that we had to be done within this life in order to have effects in this afterlife that would certainly have been in great disagreement with a tradition like Micky's.
Yeah, and you mentioned growing up from a Christian background. I would almost say that growing up as an American, in the United States, our culture is so intertwined with some of these Christian ideas that even if you're not a Christian, I remember when I was a kid, there was this Disney movie called All Dogs Go to Heaven, and we watched that in school. And so this wasn't like a
movie divided Catholics and Protestants very much.
Oh my goodness. Well, it had an impact on me, because I remember thinking for the first time, I don't know how old I was when I saw that, maybe 10, that I guess, well, this is clearly presenting heaven as though it's real. I mean, I know it's a cartoon, but all the adults seem to be agreeing with it. So do dogs go to heaven? And that's what, I wasn't particularly religious growing up. I became more religious as I kind of got into my teen years. But the concept of the heaven thing and hell, that came from just kind of pop culture and, just Americana, like not even stepping foot into a church. That was my experience. I don't know how it was for you, Micky, or Speed. You grew up in religion, but go ahead, Micky.
Oh, I was just going to say, so first of all, I hazard a guess that I'm younger than you, or I'm sorry, that you're younger than me. And
I don't know. Perhaps we could get on.
Anyway, so I was a child in the 80s, and if the U.S. seems religious now, significantly more so then. Like the secularists have a much better foothold now than they did then. And so even going to my presentation, I didn't do the careful laying out of the beliefs like Ben did, because I live in a culture where it's just so oppressively forced upon you that a lot of times, unless somebody actually pumps the brakes, you don't even think to make those kind of explanations. Now, I will say, interestingly, that there's actually, even in the Bible alone, there's 4 different explanations of afterlife. One of them is desert-based, but there are actually other alternatives as well, such as predetermination and faith-based, action-based, as mentioned, et cetera. And so we have these vague Christian concepts floating around and pushed at us at all times. But it's interesting that Christianity, rather than the rifts within Christianity, is actually what is pushed out into culture.
Yeah. And just touching quickly on that last point that you made, the Bible actually supports the Catholic idea of hell, the Protestant idea of hell, a Calvinist notion of hell, and there's a fourth one, and I can't remember what it was, but you kind of summed it up with the way that heaven and hell, by the way, it can be based on, a salvation by faith, or is it by works, or both? That's kind of another one of the big divides between Catholicism and Protestantism, I think, Speed. So, and the Bible can be used to justify kind of all of them, which is why we have all of these different kind of denominations and ideas of what hell is. I think the Jewish, or what hell and what heaven is. And I think the Jewish conception of the afterlife was very different from the Christian, even though that's also based on a lot of what is said in the Old Testament. So,
well, I wouldn't go that far, but
well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So our current conceptions of heaven and hell are very often thought of as a Christian invention, because the very few passages that are mentioned in the Tanakh or Old Testament are much, much, much more vague. But we live in a society where 2,000 years of Christianity, reading Christianity backwards into those texts. Yeah. Most of the Jewish people I know think that their religion is basically agnostic about an afterlife. That there might be one, there might not. It might have certain characteristics, it might not. That's a more common position.
I didn't go into it with that level of detail, but I think that's probably what I was trying to say, and I just didn't say it very clearly. It's different from Christianity, is where I was going with that. So,
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, Christianity seems to borrow very heavily from Zoroastrianism, which is an older religion and one of the first that has a heaven and hell based on merit. But for Zoroastrians, it's not eternal. Hell is a place where you basically have to burn away your sins in a very literal sense, and after you've suffered sufficiently for them, then you can join.
Let me go to Cease for a second. Because you were talking about being a physicalist and having an understanding of mind that is very brain dependent. Do you think that this notion of an afterlife, you kind of already answered it, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, just so that we can talk about it. Do you think that the notion of the afterlife requires the acknowledgement of the existence of souls?
Yeah, again, I think it depends on which kind of an afterlife you're referring to. I can imagine there being an afterlife that is still dependent on purely physical law that we just don't currently know, right? But in terms of what I think most people mean when they're referring to the afterlife, I think they have some idea of some kind of spirit independent, or in mind and consciousness independent of the body. And that I don't think has much basis. I mean, we can talk about the problem of consciousness and where the limitations, even in the physicalist perspective, where those limitations lie. But I don't think anywhere in that debate does it lead credence to the idea that the consciousness is completely independent. And
I use the term materialist for myself. I consider myself a materialist, and I want to make sure that we're not using different terminology for the same thing. Do you make a distinction between a materialist and a physicalist, or are they interchangeable to you?
I think that sometimes I get kind of confused because people use it differently. I think physicalist is specifically referring to consciousness. Maybe Ben, I don't know if he might know.
Do you know?
Because
that's just kind of the nature of the language game. The labels that we use are only good as the concepts that in which we're using them, and so people have used physical and material synonymously. They've used them to draw an important distinction. And some of these concepts are compatible with other concepts, and some others aren't. And so it's really it's just one of those unfortunate areas of philosophy where when you say, okay, well, what do you mean by physical and what do you mean by material? Is there an important distinction that we should be drawing there? Because oftentimes they can just be used synonymously. So it really all depends on the user and what sort of ideas they're trying to communicate by using these terms.
Sure.
I guess model. I guess I'll just define it just for simplicity's sake. For me, what I mean by that is that everything that exists within time and space. Time and space are essentially descriptions of what it means for a thing to exist.
Okay.
And so, yeah, whatever that is dependent on physical law, and it to some degree measurable, although there may be certain limitations there. And yeah, so when I think of consciousness, that tends to be kind of, I think it's just another example of that.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that based on your definition. I would say that I might even take it a step further and say that I believe that everything is reducible to material, including consciousness. But what do you think about this notion of soul speed? Do you think that you grew up religious, believing in a soul? I'm assuming that was impressed upon you by your family and society and all that. But what do you think about it now? And does it? Could souls exist?
Yeah, again, it depends on what we mean by a soul here. So do we mean a soul as in an immaterial substance that is essential to me, that survives my death?
I mean, that almost sounds like a contradiction right away. Immaterial substance. That's kind of like an oxymoron, isn't it?
Well, it might be an oxymoron, but so is jumbo shrimp. So
right.
It might turn out the phrase that seems more worrisome to me, at least at first glance, is surviving death. Like, what does it mean to survive one's own death? Because it almost seems by definition that if you've died, then you haven't survived, and that if you've survived, then you haven't experienced a death. So what did it mean to survive your death? That's not to say that there can't be some coherent story to be told here, but I've been very influenced by David Hume. He has a famous paper on the immortality of the soul. And I've also been influenced by what's been called in the literature as the argument from physical minds. This idea that, look, based on our experience, what we have reason to believe about minds is that they depend on physical structures like brains. So the reason why psychological capacities can be determined by things like genetics is because all complex mental activity has a basis in physical complex structures like a complex brain or maybe a sufficiently complex AI. But this idea of a disembodied mind, this idea of a mind existing outside of anything physical, I think is improbable. I don't rule it out in any logical sense. I don't think there are any observations that entail that that's false. But I think it's very, very implausible. I think that when you look at the evidence from things like neuroscience and genetics and morphology and just different subjects kind of converge on this idea that, minds are something that evolved and are local, and to extend them beyond that, I think, is unjustified.
And I will ask Micky the same question before we get to a couple of the questions from the chat. But regarding the soul, what are your thoughts about that, or this aspect of consciousness that could survive absent of the body?
So in a sense, I'm similar, but there's I think two things that I should clarify. One, you can believe in an afterlife and not believe in a soul, just like resurrection of the body Christians. Two, you could believe in a soul and not believe in an afterlife, right? That's perfectly consistent to say there is something that is my consciousness that is distinct from my body, but that it still ceases to be when I do. So Just to be clear, my view on soul is not going to be the know all end all on afterlife stuff. But having said that, even within philosophy of mind, I go extremely one way. Where there's no such thing in my ontology as a thought that is distinct from brain states, and there's certainly nothing beyond that. So,
okay.
Well, sorry, I shouldn't say certainly, but certainly when you are describing my views.
We got it. Okay, so we do have a question from the chat. This is from Kat the Humanist. Wants to know, how would physicalism be different than naturalism? And we'll get that question on the screen as soon as there we go. This isn't directed to anybody, but I think Cease might go that way since you described yourself as a physicalist.
Well, I would say that the one is just a more specific and narrowed view coming from the other. That's my understanding of it. I think naturalism is a more general, as far as I understand it.
It's broader, it sounds like to me. Okay. Do you guys have anything to add?
I would just use the same answer as last time. Yeah, certainly can be used in the way Cease just described it. They could all be synonymous. You could say the material is the physical is the natural, and just say that those are just three different labels to express the same concept. So just depending on the rules of the language game you want to play. Yeah. It all depends. But someone might want to draw an important distinction with those three terms, or more than one important distinction with those three terms.
So I do have a quick question.
I would add,
but sorry, go ahead.
I would add that there's an important sense in which I agree with both of you, because if you're in the domain of professional philosophy, if you're reading a philosophy paper or a philosophy book, these terms have distinct, clear line usages that were accurately described. So basically, a physicalist just is a naturalist about minds. You could be a naturalist about ethics, you could be a naturalist about several different things, but that's within the domain of professional philosophy. So once you're shifting out of that to popular discourse about religion, then it's unless you ask somebody to define their terms first, they do get merged quite a bit, and not necessarily doing anything wrong in doing so. It's not like philosophy has a monopoly on how these words are used. Yeah.
So did you want to add something, Speed?
Well, so there's been, once you get outside of the professional domain, like Micky was saying, materialist can be someone who's obsessed with acquiring things. A naturalist is someone who studies, ecosystems. It's these words just pop up kind of everywhere, and so it's super easy to talk past one another with these words. And I suspect in common parlance, when people use those words, they're not even really sure what they mean by those terms.
That's a good point. And actually, people can change the meaning of the terms throughout the course of a conversation as well. So, so the moral of the story is define your terms or request clarification if you don't know what the person means. I do want to get to producer Wes is in the chat, and he has a question. Actually, he looks like he's got a couple of questions. So first one is, if there was an afterlife, what problems would there be? Could any of those concepts of heaven and hell not end with an immortal, boring existence singing gospels? Okay, I have thoughts about that, but let's start with you, Micky.
So there's
it probably depends on which afterlife, but
that's part of it. So the aforementioned Hume essay identifies some problems in inferring an afterlife, but also conceptual problems. And for Hume, the biggest ones were, if we do a specifically desert-based afterlife, that is one that's supposed to be based on merit or justice, there's problems such as the fact that, you have a tiny finite life in an infinite afterlife. If that's the one you ascribe to, that can't be just, because you're either giving an infinite reward for finite actions, or an infinite punishment for finite actions. So either of those
There's
is
a mismatch
problem.
there.
Yeah. Also, punishment without purpose is going to detract from moral perfection. If afterlife is sectarian, that is, if it's even easier for people of, say, the Christian faith or a specific Christian faith to get into heaven, you have just utterly destroyed any chance of justice in the world. Because, well, about somebody born in feudal Japan is automatically excluded from these rewards. So those are the big kind of worrisome moral ones. But there are conceptual ones as well. So if you are unembodied afterlife, well, you ever stop and think about what that would be like? No sight, no hearing, no sense. How would you even know you're in an afterlife or a heaven? Because there's just thought.
And there would be no sensation either. You wouldn't be able to feel anything or experience anything.
And are you causally isolated from everyone else? Because I communicate with other minds through physical processes like speech. Or motion, but there's no space or time supposedly in at least some models of the afterlife.
Yeah, most of them still include time, weirdly, but that's common with a sempiternal soul, but it creates a ton of problems, as Wes hinted at. Well, humans, at least as we exist now, are beings that are prone to boredom. And things like repetition, things like lack of goals. If you're not struggling for anything anymore and you're not creating anything anymore, and which
it's really, you can't risk
I think that
okay,
I've created every invention possible. That killed a few billion years, but what else am I going to do?
This leads directly into producer Wes's next question, which we'll go ahead and highlight now and then keep talking. But the question is, wouldn't an afterlife be torturous if it was a consciousness that survived, especially under these circumstances, which, you described the survival where it's just existing without sensation or purpose or.
And theists have things to say about this, but different ones are going to say different things. But my concern, and this is something I've been working on in my research lately, my concern is that there's these trade-offs that might lead to a dilemma. So to start with, take the full on, I've heard it defended that, well, when you're in heaven, you're just going to be so awed by the divine presence, you're just going to be like joyfully sitting in God's light for eternity. You seem to lose any sense of identity in that answer. Like flat and simple, there's your loss of consciousness, individuality, etc., all gone. But the rest of the trade-offs seem to be degrees. Well, if my limits are removed when I go to an afterlife, so I'm not prone to boredom anymore, or that I enjoy repetition, or that my mind can somehow become infinite, is there? The more of these changes you make, the more you lose personal identity and undercut the coherence of a personal, infinite survival. But
my friend Oz from the Atheist Network group, he has the thought that anyone in heaven is not the same person that they were before they went to heaven. Nobody existing can be who they are in heaven. You would be a fundamentally changed person because, especially under the Christian model, where all of your pain and suffering and worries will be wiped away. That means you necessarily will forget all of the people who you knew and loved who went to hell, right? So if they don't exist in your reality anymore, you're not the same person. You're not the same person in the sense that if you have different desires and different memories and different experiences for eternity and an eternal mind that was once finite, that's a completely different person. So all sense of personhood is lost as well. So Speed, I think you were trying to say something before I interjected with that, and I'll let you finish before I move on to the next question.
Oh yeah. So I've been intrigued of recent by Martin Hagelin's book called This Life, Spiritual Freedom and Secular Faith. And so the central thesis of that book is that death, or a finite life, the finitude to our lives, is a necessary condition for our lives having meaning. And that this idea of an eternal afterlife collapses this idea that it could be meaningful, because what motivates us to act, to care about our projects, to take risks, is because we recognize that they're finite, that they might fail, or that we might run out of time to complete them. But if your tasks can't fail and you have an infinite amount of time to procrastinate to do them, there's at no point there becomes no motivation to do one thing rather than another, and that an infinite eternal existence would then cease to be meaningful. And so I thought it's really kind of a neat thesis, because it kind of turns the common intuition on its head that, hey, an afterlife is something good, like it's something that we should want to be the case. And that
do I have any Star Trek fans here?
So yeah, but I'm not like a hardcore diehard.
Okay. Well, the reason I bring it up is because two things. One, there's one of the newest shows, Star Trek Picard, has a scene with Data, who's a character who died previously years ago, but he's back. He's back in this show, and
because he's a robot.
He's an android, but part of his consciousness, so they were able to bring it back. But he has a request. Hopefully I'm not spoiling this, but this was in like one of the first couple of episodes, so if you haven't seen it by now, sorry. He has a request that Picard deactivate him permanently, and then Picard asks him why, and he says, because a butterfly that lasts forever isn't a butterfly at all, right? So the whole idea of existing forever, life is only precious because it's temporary. And so that's a point he makes, and that's piggybacking off of what you just said. There have been other episodes of that show that dealt with this concept of immortality as well, because there's a species called the Q that live forever, and they have godlike powers, and they like know everything. But one of them finally gets to the point where he wants to commit suicide because there's nothing else to do. He's already seen everything. He knows everything. He's been everything. And the existence is just kind of mundane and boring and torturous for him. So do you want to say something?
Yeah, I never understood the idea that if we are to die, that somehow makes life meaningless. It's like a song isn't less beautiful because it ends. Like it to me, always seemed like a complete non sequitur. Actually, there's a quote I want to read that follows through this line of thinking. I don't know how many of you have seen Waking Life. It was a film that came out, I think, a couple decades ago. But this is one of the quotes from the film. 1,000 years is about an instant. There's nothing new, nothing different. The same pattern over and over. The same clouds, the same music, the same insight I felt an hour or an eternity ago. There's nothing here for me now, nothing at all. Now I remember, this happened to me before. This is why I left. You have begun to find your answers, although it will seem difficult. The rewards will be great. Exercise your human mind as fully as possible, knowing it is only an exercise. Build beautiful artifacts, solve problems, explore the secrets of the physical universe, savor the input from all the senses, feel the joy and the sorrow, the laughter, the empathy, compassion, and tote the emotional memory in your travel bag. I remember where I came from and how I became human, why I hung around, and now my final departure is scheduled. This way out, escaping velocity, not just eternity, but infinity. So I think that's a really great quote to kind of capture this idea that there is a beauty in things being finite, and that the opposite of that would almost be like a prison for at least some people.
We have a question from the chat from someone called Nature I want to get to. I don't know that this directly touches on what we're talking about, but we'll go ahead and get your thoughts on it. Nature wants to know, do atheists believe in karma? So I'll...
So I'll go ahead and say that Michael Huemer is a philosopher who certainly sympathizes with atheism and who puts forward the idea of an afterlife that's reincarnation and based on something karma-like. So certainly atheists, naturalists might not be able to believe in this, or maybe they can in some convoluted way. Atheists can have a whole spectrum of different views about things like karma or reincarnation.
I'll put it like this. I'm an atheist. I do believe in karma, but it probably depends on how we're defining karma. I believe in it from a very naturalistic perspective, in the sense that if you're like kind of a shitty person and you're just a dick to everybody, well, that's probably going to come back at you, in the sense that other people are probably not going to be very friendly towards you, and you're not going to get respected as a person. And that's just kind of human nature. There's nothing supernatural or prophetic about that. It's just kind of the way that people are. So if we're defining karma that way, then I say yes. If we're defining karma as the universe having some grand design to where, bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, I would say no. I don't think that there's any indication that there's an intelligence or design or plan by the universe or gods or anything like that.
I would just point out the traditional depictions of karma. First of all, don't require a conscience. There's no intent there. Karma is treated simply as another law of nature. And so as such, there's a perfectly consistent atheist position that believes in karma. So, for instance, Jainism is an atheist religion, and karma is central to it. And they actually have a materialist version of karma where it's these kind of transient particles that actually can stick to you. So there's nothing inconsistent with certain depictions of karma, but as Bryce pointed out, well, if you're intending it as a notion of cosmic justice rather than cosmic law, then you're kind of stepping outside of the atheist perspective. Having said that, the evidential standards and requirements that lead many people to be atheists will often have trouble with some of the supporting arguments and texts that posit the existence of karma.
We have a very secular perspective on this channel and tend to take it for granted that, most religious concepts like the afterlife are inventions of man and inventions of human civilizations. That being the case, where do you guys think that the belief in an afterlife originated, and why? Or I guess a better way to ask it is, why does it come about? Why do religions incorporate this idea, or cultures? Is it? I heard Cease mention something earlier about fear of death. Is that the reason?
I think that's one of them. I think that maybe not so much where it originated, although I think it does relate, but certainly why I think a lot of people hold down to that idea now. I think fear of death is a central factor in religion in general. But I'm sure that it's not the only one.
Yeah. How do you feel about that, Speed?
So I'm going to start off by saying I don't know. So I'm sure that there's some pretty sophisticated research that's gone into this question that I'm just not familiar with. But at first glance, when I look at this question, I think that from an evolutionary standpoint, something like the recognition of our deaths and others' deaths was a very important feature of the phenomenology of early life for humankind. And that it also presented these mysteries. Death is kind of one of those things where like people don't come back for it. You don't, is there, it's ripe for literature to have this, this idea of this window that no one can look through. And of course, literature has built up narratives of going on this other side of it and coming back as, Odysseus goes down to Hades and then, comes back, Jesus dies and 3 days later is resurrected. We see this motif. And so I'm sure that played some role in early, stories like that, this mystery, this wonder about events that we know happen to each other and are very emotional. We associate them with ritual. And I'm sure all of these played certain psychological functions and those details I'm totally ignorant of.
Mikey, did you have anything to add to that? Or Mickey? Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I called you Mikey. I meant Mickey. My bad.
There's complex psychological interactions and historical ones and the like. But I think a couple of important ones to realize is, one, belief in an afterlife is not inherent to human nature. There are entire civilizations and societies and peoples that believe in no afterlife at all. One of my favorite anecdotes.
I'm glad you added that. I'm glad you added that, because what I thought you meant for a second is that belief in an afterlife is something that even animals have, and aliens also have it. So it's not inherent to humanity. But you were saying in the sense that, you know, there are people who don't have that belief.
Yeah, one of my favorite anecdotes I used in my book was the people in the Roman Empire used to, instead of RIP on their tombs, they'd have an abbreviation that stood for I was not, I was, I am not, I care not. Just kind of to emphasize you have an entire culture that, even though they have gods, they don't really have any central notion of the afterlife. But notice, when you have that kind of culture, then all of a sudden certain religions have something to offer, a better lot. And so religions that have pushed desirable, for different reasons, depiction of an afterlife carried significantly more conversionary value for the religions that care about conversion. And depictions of the afterlife could be desirable for a lot of reasons. Well, yeah, everybody wants to live longer. I don't think anybody ever wants to live eternally. They just haven't thought about it yet. But everybody wants to live longer. But also, people want to see justice, right? They want to know that bad people will get punished. That is a deep psychological desire. And so people selling that depiction of the afterlife are going to be more popular as well. And to be clear, I'm not saying religions do this deliberately and transactionally to trick people. What I'm saying is, when you have clusters of beliefs about the afterlife that fulfill certain needs and desires we have in nature, those are much more likely to be adhered to and defended.
Yeah. We'll get to Wes's last question there, although I think it may have been answered. But the question is, what would an afterlife otherwise look like without a consciousness? And my answer is pretty quick. It wouldn't look like anything. Because
what would anything else look like without consciousness? How do you even answer that question? Like, to compare two things presupposes consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't look like anything because there's nothing to experience the looking. If we go with the that, I don't know, that's the simple answer that I can think of, unless somebody has something to add.
You apparently read half the question, according to the producer.
Pardon?
The producer just said that you only read the first line.
Oh, that's all I got. So yeah, maybe that was supposed to be combined. So, there we go. Souls of reincarnation, perhaps that forgot their former lives.
The reincarnation cycle.
Sorry, I was trying to put it all together.
I'm not. Go ahead and reword that, Wes, and give us the kind of the full question there. And while he's doing that, I did want to expand on the last question that I asked about, because I think I started with fear of death. There is also the element of this desire to see one's loved ones again, for people who've if you've lost someone close to you, this idea that they're somewhere in heaven.
You'll be reunited.
You'll be united. You'll get to see them again, to bring you kind of the closure that maybe you never had. I think that that's very desirable for people as well. And a lot of people want to believe that because they never got closure. For the people who believe in an afterlife, I don't think that they got closure with the person's death. And they think that comes in the afterlife, which I think is kind of sad, but I don't know. Okay. So what do we have here? Go ahead and highlight yourself, Wes. What are the problems of reincarnation if thought out? There we go. So What do you guys think about the idea of reincarnation? I mean, I think I know where Cease stands on this, because it's kind of the same dilemma for you, where it wouldn't really be reincarnation. It would just be a different person that's, coming.
And also,
so that's just it. It's all of our empirical observations will be the same, whether it's true or false.
also,
So that's what makes it difficult.
how would we explain the fact that humanity has grown in population? Like, are these reincarnated souls like fractions of the original souls? Like,
yeah, it's almost raises the question of, is everyone living reincarnated, or do we get new souls that come up in addition to the reincarnated ones? I mean, that would be the only thing that could account for the growth of population.
Right.
I see it as a theoretical postulate, and so that it's something that we're putting into our model of reality. And so, what does it do for us? And so I guess that's just an open question for me. I'm not going to say that I'm closed to models that have reincarnation as part of them, but for me, I know that someone like Michael Huemer might think that this gives us an advantage in answering questions about personal identity, but I just take a different view about personal identity than he does. And so again, I'm just left at the end of the day of what function is this serving, or am I like Laplace to Napoleon? Like I have no use for that hypothesis.
Another good, well, I won't say good. It's my question, so I'll let you guys be the judge of it. But another question is for people who believe that God is responsible for life and afterlives, why would God create beings to live forever or to experience an eternal existence? And that's something I never really could reconcile with.
Well, that one I think is easier to answer because he's perfectly loving and eternal himself. So he created finite creatures to have an eternal, infinite, loving relationship with. And so, barring that this isn't somehow boring over eternal, this is the other side of that, that intuition of death might be necessary for a meaningful life. There's also this idea that God would be like an omnipotent being that was perfectly loving. And so you're like, if you ask like, well, could God love me forever? Could he keep me entertained forever? Well, yeah, because he's omnipotent. So there's dueling intuitions here.
My intuition is that in Christianity, the religion I grew up in, Christians believe that we ought to be thankful to God for bringing us into the world and giving us life and providing us for the opportunity to have an afterlife. Well, we're going to get one whether we ask for it or not. But that's kind of the problem, because a lot of them never stop to consider that none of us asked for this in the first place. I mean, no God ever consulted me on whether I wanted to be created or live forever, right? So humans had no free will to determine that we would live forever or have an afterlife. He just kind of did that on his own, irrespective of our feelings about it. So why would he deserve our thanks? I mean, at least give us the option if we want an afterlife or not, or if we want to live eternal.
And people have postulated that. There's nothing inconsistent with that.
Well, there's nothing inconsistent for the people who postulated that, but I don't think that that's the majority of Christianity.
Well,
certainly.
I get but I think the harder questions are, given there is an afterlife, why would God create us to have natures to fear death? Right? That's a much harder question. Well,
what's the point of this life? If there's
that's a second one, right? Why build a world where it sure seems like there's not an afterlife, and yet the afterlife is supreme important, etc. Yeah, I think the inference problems tend to be harder than the conceptual problems if you're willing to let God wave around an omnipotence wand.
Yeah. I think that I don't know, the model of the afterlife I came up with was similar to you, Speed. Heaven and hell, and it's an ultimatum, really. It's, you are going to live forever. The question is, do you live forever in...
The stakes are high.
Yeah, the stakes are,
It's
do you
like
live
what we
forever
do in this
paradise?
life matters, and you better get it right because you get one shot, and that one shot determines an infinite fate, and that infinite fate can be good or it can be bad.
And actually, in the version of Christianity I know, it isn't about actions at all. It isn't about actions, behaviors, good deeds, or anything.
Calvinist, yeah. Some people are just predestined.
Well, I wasn't going
hell.
to say Calvinist because I wasn't a Calvinist. I didn't believe in predetermination, but it was about whether you were willing to devote your worship to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior for the remission of sins. And that was the ticket. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, no matter how shitty of a person they are.
Deathbed recant.
And anyone who doesn't will be condemned because they had not believed. So it's all about believing. It wasn't even really about how good of a person you are. But the ultimatum is worship me or burn in hell for eternity. What kind of shit deal is that?
But that to be clear, that's not every Christian.
It's not all Christians.
Just careful,
But that's evangelical.
That is certainly a yes. There's a reason I came down hardest on evangelical Christianity in my book.
Yeah.
It's a damaging belief. It has gross, corrosive, negative impact on society to hold exclusivist beliefs about an afterlife that are also focused on belief rather than action. Those two together just create, just from a pure cause and effect standpoint, the worst consequences in terms of an afterlife.
I also think it's not logical. It doesn't make any sense. What purpose would that serve? This idea of revenge, it's a primitive, evil emotion, and it just seems
certain
difficult.
Concepts of justice use that. So they say, a retributive conception of justice. Like, look, people who do bad things have bad things coming, and it's good that these bad things happen to these bad people.
Sure,
so
but
retributive justice entails proportion in a way that a lot of depictions do.
Right. Yeah, and Micky already mentioned that infinite punishment for finite crimes wouldn't be a just system, right? So there would be some other reason why a God would have you survive infinitely to experience his judgment or revenge. But why?
So the apologetics reply to this is often that God is an infinite being, and so that sinning, acting contrary to God's will, is an infinite crime, and that an infinite crime is deserving of an infinite punishment. And so that's why, and so that, again, this is justice, that this is supposedly compatible with God's justice, love, and mercy, that these can just, that there's no issue here, no logical tension, as you mentioned it, but I think there very clearly is, and it's not hard to kind of hash that out.
And does that work, Speed?
So I don't think so. I don't think
the reason I'm asking you that is because on this channel, really on any show that I'm going to be the host in, I will allow for theistic talking points as long as there's a rebuttal to them. So you gave the talking point, now give the rebuttal.
So really the rebuttal is that if we suppose that God is perfectly loving, perfectly just, and unsurpassably merciful, I think it's overdetermined at that point, that there's not this retributive concept of justice where a God would infinitely punish, he would give infinite punishments for finite crimes, or he would eternally separate a finite creature that he created for the purpose of having a relationship, or that he would be so unmerciful as to never let someone redeem themselves. I think that when you take the concepts of mercy, justice, and love seriously, it over-determines that this retributive concept of an infinite punishment, it just rules it out. It's that can't be the way reality is.
Yeah, and I
think bare justice rules it out too.
Sure, there's a lot of different. I guess my answer is, if God is all knowing and he would have foreseen all of the people that he created, that some of them would go to hell. If he had the power to do it differently, and he chose to create them anyway, knowing that they would go to hell, well, then he's not a moral, just or merciful God. He's neither of those things, because it didn't have to be that way. He chose to do it that way on purpose. So that would be my resolution. Okay, Aaron has a question for us. Can an infinite afterlife without the consent of the human or the soul ever be moral?
I would say no, because I think for something to be moral, that you have to have consent.
Yeah.
And anything that is an imposition of will and an imposition on your well-being, I would deem that as immoral, basically by definition.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying. Like, none of us were consulted about this. Like, he didn't ask any of us whether we wanted to exist eternally or not. He just kind of decided, So he may be an infinite being, but there's nothing about that says he had to make us that way. So if he did, then he's immoral, especially if one of the conclusions to that infinite being is eternal torment and hell. So I don't see how that can be fixed conceptually.
I think it could be fixed conceptually if there is still time for consent after death. I think that, well, if you're in this eternal bliss and somebody says, "Hey, you want to stick around for a while longer?" and you say, "Sure," then no thanks there. I think the fact that we don't have I don't think that if non-consent eternality is built into us, then I think that's probably just another version of the problem of evil, and a lot of what we say for one goes for the other. Simply in terms of whether certain solutions work or not. Well, what obligations does the creator have to the created? But there are certainly ways to fix it, and
okay.
I think it's fixable. I think it is not fixed in popular presentations and discourse.
Popular religion.
Although I have heard quite a few people, not theologians, but I've heard quite a few people say their view on the afterlife is basically everybody gets what they believe in the afterlife. In which case, somebody who doesn't believe in an afterlife, that's the end of it for them.
What about someone who doesn't know what they believe?
As I said, they were not theologians who have espoused these views, but it's fun to think about.
I'm not sure whether or not this.
Worth...
Oh, you go ahead. I'm sorry, Micky.
Whenever people start talking about an eternal afterlife, I really remind them of the timelines involved, because I think a lot of people who view an afterlife as good are really just want more life, and those are very different. Like, think there have been 25 lifetimes since the time of Jesus, right? That's not much. And so when you're talking about, well, I like to watch football. Okay, imagine you've watched not just every football game ever, but everyone possible, and everyone possible a trillion times, right? There's once you get rid of finitude, things can get crazy. If we're limited to materiality, for instance, every invention possible has already been invented, unless there's some wild way to get new concepts and things together. And just the sheer volume of time we're talking about should give us pause and should make us recoil, unless we posit that somehow humans are just radically different once they're dead.
I have a question for the panel, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you guys, when we were talking about consciousness earlier, I think it was Micky? Yeah.
Micky,
who said you are an identity theorist? Is that what you said? That you said that. Mm-hmm. So are you aware of the problems in that?
I am.
And so what is? And I guess we should probably break this down for the audience. But what is your response to that? Because I used to be one, and I'm not one anymore.
So I think the fix it. So first of all, and I know this sounds weaselly, but I don't think there's a problem-free theory of mind. And so the question is volume of problem. And so why I think that identity theory can be rendered much less problematic than is usually presented is because I don't just identify a thought with a brain state. I identify it with a brain state in a certain system. So, well, is this, 500-page stack of ones and zeros a picture of the Titanic? it is in the right system. And so once we start thinking along those lines, the kind of the knee-jerk reaction against identity theory, I think, shrinks down considerably.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
So I'm something of an anti-reductionist. So I'm in the non-reductive physicalist camp. So I'm someone like Galen Strawson's view. He calls it real materialism. And so it's this idea that our very concept of when we say the physical is just going to involve something like phenomenal consciousness. It's going to be part. And so this is a panpsychist view. And so I know it sounds crazy, but like Micky was saying, like I think all the views in philosophy of mind sound crazy when you flesh them out, and they all have their various problems. And I'm still not satisfied with my view in the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of the mind-body problem is one of those just really great questions, because I just feel I have a feeling I'm just going to be wrestling with it the rest of my life, and so who knows what my views are going to be in a few years.
And the one thing I want to add, just because it seems very relevant to some of our discussions, is I from my personal experience within the domain of philosophy, and so I think I could probably extrapolate that out a little. It seems like philosophy of mind is the last place where kind of some of these Platonic ideas that are really supernaturalist cling. And I think the farther away we get from that, the better in terms of pure practicality. So let me give for instance, on some a very ardent atheist was reading a draft of my book and believed that thoughts entail other thoughts. Like no, that's putting magic in thoughts. Thoughts don't entail thoughts, right? Propositions entail. Propositions entail propositions, but there is no sense in which 2 + 2 the thought of 2 + 2 entails 4. That's trying to sneak Platonism back into brains, and I think that's that's something I like to just keep as far at arm's length as possible, is to avoid spooky stuff that leads back into all these unphysical and necessary things.
I want to get producer Wes's last question in, just because we're getting down to the time, and I don't know how applicable this is or not, but do you guys have any thoughts on? Do you have any knowledge about the Mormon concept of the afterlife, the 3 kingdoms, celestial, terra, etc.?
They have a wild conception of an afterlife, but
I don't know about
it's wild.
Yeah.
Like I'm certain. So, dude, first preface this: Mormons have a very wide range of views about the afterlife, but some of the more wilder sects that I find very fascinating are these ideas that we go off into space and have other planets that we will populate, and we will become gods of these realms ourselves. And there's these levels of heaven too, and so that again, certain ways in which you act in this world determine what sort of level you're going to have in the afterlife. That's more of the less mainstream views of the afterlife for Mormons. I don't want to try to I feel like Mormons get over caricaturized, and so I'm trying not to characterize their views.
Yeah, that's
too
fair.
much.
I want to know: is there any naturalistic or scientific outlook on an afterlife? In other words, could we possibly create an afterlife by figuring out consciousness, whether it be reanimating dead tissue or brain transplants or cybernetic transfer? Could we make afterlives in that way? What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think at that point, an afterlife just becomes how we extend lives into the future. That there are these periods where we quote unquote die, but then we come back to life. It's just parts of our lives are disconnected at this point, and so they're an afterlife in the sense of extending the conscious experiences of our finite minds, yes, I think we can do that. But
like if we were,
again, we're going to cover. What do you mean by create an afterlife? Can we create an immaterial realm?
Well, no, I guess what I mean is,
I don't.
I'm talking about in the purely naturalistic sense of the universe. Like if we could find a way to copy or duplicate brain states in a new body,
I don't know. Perhaps someone else has some more sophisticated thoughts on this.
I should probably also add that I don't think anybody knows the answer. I guess I'm just asking, like, what do you guys think? Do you think that could ever be, could that fall within the realm of science?
I mean, I think it's obviously any of these things are an open question. It just seems unlikely given what we know so far. If somehow we find out that we've been wrong about our understanding of minds and consciousness and all these things, and that will just become part of our growing understanding of reality. But I don't see any reason to be particularly hopeful that that's what's going to happen.
Is it because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where we can't duplicate? Which, if does anyone know what that is? It's basically this idea in physics to where it's impossible for us to know the exact location or the exact momentum of every particle. And so when you're talking about duplicating brain states, you would kind of have to know that in order to recreate or extend a mind. So we might be going outside of the scope of the question. So if I don't want to talk above or outside of the scope of that, but
I think that an important addendum is, even if we could create an afterlife, we could not create an eternal afterlife, right? When our galaxy smashes into the next one, any number of brains in jars enjoying brain states will cease.
Well, that's disappointing. I just want my cyborg body after this one. I want a new and improved body that's going to.
I'm a nuclear engineer, and I'm still waiting on my superpowers. Someone keeps telling me that I'm going to get superpowers, but I just haven't gotten any yet.
Sneak an octopus in with you. Come on.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I've been missing.
That went over my head, but
to get the radioactive mixture to give him a superpower.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Well,
I naturally assume they're the coolest animal to get superpowers from because they do so much stuff.
They really are pretty fascinating.
I don't know how you guys feel about this. I am pro euthanasia. Actually, no, I'm not pro euthanasia. I'm pro doctor assisted suicide because I find, one, I think that people deserve the right to die with dignity, but just on a more meta level than that, I find the concept of forcing someone to live because you think they ought to is immoral. And I feel like that's what a lot of these God concepts are that have afterlives associated with them. It's someone else, some other mind forcing you to have an existence that you didn't ask for or may not necessarily even want.
Yeah, so, I agree with that. I think obviously there is some details that need to be ironed out, right? Like anybody who is to commit, is to go through that would need, I think, a certain psychological profile to make sure that they can actually are in a position to consent and all those things. But yeah, I don't think that it's right for somebody who's suffering and can't get out of the suffering to be forced to keep living. But
yeah, and even if they're not suffering, I mean, they may just be. It could be the situation to where they are bored with life and have seen it all and done it all, and they just want to go, And I feel like once you start talking about these ideas of eternal existence and eternal afterlives, you're going to get to that point at some point. So that's how I feel about it. But I don't know. I think I think it was Micky who said earlier that we are much less religious now in terms of the United States, the culture in the United States, than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Do you think that the belief in the afterlife will continue to trend downward as we continue to go forward?
I have no idea.
You have no idea.
I would best be speculating. I don't know what human psychological. 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 I don't know what human psy factors will be in the future.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to say. Like I was saying before, I think the fear of death is something that's hard to divorce humanity from. Whether or not, how that might change in the future, I think is obviously, I'm open to seeing that change.
The interesting question is whether, given that fear of death, do you overcome that fear or do you deny the death?
Right.
Yeah, and the people who have no religious affiliation, the new nuns as they call them, have grown by 200% in the last 20 years. Now, you wouldn't know that because we still have, tight evangelical control of all parts of the government. But well, I mean, I'm not exaggerating.
No, I know.
It's
I know.
Wildly disproportionate.
I'm biting my tongue right now.
30%, over 30% of the U.S. is non-Christian, and over 95% of our federal electees are Christian. So,
so they say.
I think you'll see. Oh yeah, you have to toe the line. But yeah, I think you'll continue to see numbers stressing away from that. Can I do a complete non sequitur and say just a few things about reincarnation? I apologize, but
yes, I don't know that would be a non sequitur, but go ahead.
I think there's, as is classically presented, that is the samsara cycle of Hinduism. I think it's really important to realize the goal is to actually break free of the reincarnation cycle. So the goal of the religion is to avoid eternal life. And I really think that kind of puts a few things in perspective, that if you just kind of hear, this vague notion about it, that gets avoided and it connects.
That's a great point, actually.
Said a while ago. Yeah.
That's a great point, because that would actually be a religion. So that answers the question of to what end, or to, for what reason, for what purpose. That's the thing that's missing from all of the other ones that just have this eternal afterlife. Like there's no reason for it. There's no goal. Living forever to be living to forever. Like, so what, But yeah, the reincarnation, if there's a purpose of escaping the eternal reality, that seems to make more sense to me. Having said that, I still don't believe in it, but it makes more sense.
Oh, no, yeah. That's
just to make that clear.
People like to make it look like a much worse afterlife system. It's actually more philosophically nuanced, because philosophy got into religion in Hinduism 1,000 years before it did in Western traditions, and so you'll find some very interesting presentations for sure.
Sure. Okay, and now before we go, here's the real non sequitur. I am 44 years old, so I was born in the 70s. Go ahead, Micky. What you got?
I got 41. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
You look young.
I appreciate it. I get that a lot, but it's rare that I get guests who are older than me. So
people always guess me much older. So trust me, it's better the other way around.
What a great conversation. I don't think we really came to a resolution on anything. I don't know that there's anything to resolve. I think a lot of you opened by saying we don't know, or a couple of you said you don't.
It's a perennial question of philosophy.
Yeah,
we'll talk about it forever.
Yeah, I don't deal with. I don't talk about what I know very often. I concede to not knowing very many things. I don't need. I don't admit absolute certainty about anything except my own existence, right? So I'm a solipsist in that way. But I think I'm probably, my beliefs kind of align towards cease. I think you and I are probably kind of on the same page. Conceptually, I get why there is an afterlife in all of these different cultures and societies. Fear of death, talked about missing loved ones, just wanting to have longer life. So there's a couple of different reasons that probably all intersect to bolster this belief. I don't think it makes a lot of rational sense. I think it appears to be contradictory to what we see in nature, and I kind of wish that we could evolve society so where we're not so dependent on this belief, so that we can kind of get more value out of this life, promoting what we have here, extending life. tying up all the loose ends, making more positive relationships here while we have them instead of hoping to reconcile them in some other life. I don't think people should depend on this notion of having another life to decide what their morals are, or to try to make them a better person. I think that if you should be a good person, to other people while we're here, because life is short. So you shouldn't be a good person, to try to get into the next life, because there's no concept of that. So those are my thoughts. Anybody got any final thoughts on the afterlife before we wrap it up?
Oh, thanks again for having me. I think it was interesting.
Yes, thank you again for having me.
It's always fun to have you guys. You guys are always invited back. These are great discussions. Ben Speed Watkins of Real Atheology, you got anything upcoming that you want to share?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a project series on David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully we'll be able to bring some really useful content for people who want to tackle that work.
Fair enough. And CeasetoKnow, Axioms on Trial. What can we predict in your future?
So I think we're doing a show this weekend, and also we're going to be coming out with some scripted episodes as well. Usually, so far we've done just live ones, but we're going to be doing like mini series on philosophy and science, where we actually have some scripts and out there. And I'm thinking I might do a series on Merleau-Ponty, who's a French phenomenologist, and what his views on that is. But yeah, definitely more things coming up soon. So
awesome. Well, we all look forward to that. And Professor C. Micky Lorkowski, author of Atheism Considered. Let's get a shot of that book one more time. There it is, Atheism Considered, a survey of rational rejection of religious belief. Out.
It's a very good book.
Oh, you've read it?
Yes, it's a very,
Sweet.
very good book.
There you go. So is that your latest and final project, Micky, or
No, that was just my main projects involve, what I'm teaching and what I'm researching while I'm teaching. So I am working on some afterlife stuff now, which is why I mentioned this. That'd be a fun topic when Wes asks. So awesome. I'm working on that argument I mentioned about, well, think about you as you wouldn't want to live eternally. And how many changes would you have to make to actually find eternal life desirable? Would you still be you at that point? So that's the question I'm really interested in right now. I've been working on some stuff.
That's the one I really want to read. So I can't wait for that one to come out, because I have many thoughts about that. So in any case, I appreciate all of you guys. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for everyone who was participating in the chat as well. I'd like to give a shout out to all of the patrons as well. Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Deborah Grace, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. So thank you guys for the support. Secular Soapbox is on Wednesdays, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can find links to our guests in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And for Wes, Aaron, Sunny, Kat, Trent, Phil, Shane, and Jena, my name is Bryceronee. We'll see you guys next time on Secular Soapbox.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief. There's something that'll have what you need. What you need. We're broken, it's tragic. We're not all elastic, but maybe there's magic. Believe you could have it. And I know of sadness, the anxious and panic, the infinite vastness of all that is blackness.